Judge Thomas's mahogany-paneled chambers were a stench of corruption and pricey cigars. The morning heat in Ouagadougou was already rising outside, but three men were whispering plans within this air-conditioned fortress. Thomas's pale fingers drummed against sensitive folders as he adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles. A big packet was passed across the polished desk by Dubois, the French company lawyer. He said, "At all costs, the mining contracts must be protected." With eyes as frigid as winter steel, Thomas nodded. Thomas hissed, his American accent piercing the tension. "Traoré thinks he can just waltz in here and challenge decades of established law." Sankara, the third man, was a local politician who shifted uneasily in his leather chair. "The people adore him, Judge. If we exert too much pressure..." Both guys jumped when Thomas banged his gavel down. "Sankara, the public doesn't comprehend international law." He lowered his voice to a whisper. "They don't understand consequences. However, they will." Reporters, diplomats, and interested citizens were already swarming into the courtroom. Beyond these chambers, the sound of voices, chairs scratching, and the anxious energy of a crowd perceiving history in the making were all audible to Thomas. Glancing at his reflection in the window overlooking the busy streets below, he straightened. His black robes, colorful displays were being built up by market vendors. Kids were rushing to school. Everything was going on as usual. However, Thomas was aware that all will change in 2 hours. Despite the air conditioning, Dubois's pricey suit was rumpled. From the humidity as he rose up with his briefcase in hand, he declared with glee, "The fine is calculated to bankrupt any resistance movement." Thomas grinned, but it was a predatory grin that stopped short of his eyes. An amount of $500 million? Not even a revolutionary could make it through it. He approached his desk, took the prepared verdict in his hands, and felt its weight. He would shatter the soul of a man today who ventured to question the status quo. Supporters crowded the steps of the courtroom, waving Burkina Faso flags, which shone brightly in the morning sun in shades of red, green, and yellow. Ibrahim Traoré declined his security team's recommendation for a bulletproof automobile and got out of his basic government vehicle. In sharp contrast to the pricey suits of the foreign lawyers gathered inside, his military fatigues were modest, but well preserved. In order to see their president, children from neighboring schools had skipped class, their voices singing his name. Ibrahim stopped and covered his heart, while gazing up at the massive colonial lira structure. He whispered to his assistant, "We have to face the ghosts of our past today." Whispers trailed Ibrahim like shadows down the marble corridor leading to the courtroom. With tense expressions, European diplomats huddled in corners, waiting for what they hoped would be his collapse. Local reporters advanced with their cameras, documenting every second of this momentous occasion. Ibrahim's eyes stayed composed and focused despite his security detail, moving about him like a wall of protection. Feeling the burden of his ancestors' hardships, he paused in front of the courtroom's hefty wooden doors. "We speak only truth," he said to his legal team, "no matter what happens in there." Ibrahim entered the courtroom, his demeanor intimidating despite his youth, and the room fell silent. Judge Thomas searched through files while his robes billowed, and he sat high on his bench like a colonial administrator from decades before. A sea of faces, some afraid, others eager, waited to see history take shape in the gallery. When the bailiff announced his arrival, Ibrahim chose to sit at the defendant's table rather than stand. Ibrahim was staring at Thomas, interpreting the man's intents from his calculating, hard gaze, while his lawyer, Fatou, a clever Burkinabe woman, leaned over to update him on last-minute developments. 3 piercing bangs of Thomas's gavel reverberated off the tall ceiling like bullets. With the authority of centuries of imposed justice, he declared, "This court is now in session." With his hands comfortably folded on the table in front of him, Ibrahim straightened in his chair. His breathing was calm and under control, but the tension around him was thick enough to sever with a knife. He had previously been the target of international pressure, coups, and assassinations. It would be the same now. Ibrahim temporarily closed his eyes and prayed silently for his people as Thomas started reading the charges. Like a predator poised to attack its prey, Judge Thomas savored the moment by noisily clearing his throat. As he raised the prepared decision, everyone in the courtroom held their breath. Despite the enormity of what he was about to unleash, his hands remained steady. "President Traoré," he said, his tone brimming with fictitious power, "you have violated international mining agreements signed by past administrations." According to this court, sensing the trap that had been meticulously set over months of covert discussions, the gallery shook uncomfortably, expecting to see panic. Thomas hesitated, allowing the tension to develop like storm clouds forming over the savannah. Instead, he saw quiet determination instead. "The penalties for breach of these legally binding contracts are severe and non-negotiable," Thomas added, his American accent making the Burkinabe citizens in the room wring their ears. A number of diplomats in the front seats leaned forward, prepared to document this moment of expected triumph in their notebooks. As he calculated the revenues that would be sent back to Paris, the French corporate lawyer Dubois grinned faintly from his seat. Like a weapon poised to strike a deadly blow, Thomas raised the verdict higher. "This court hereby orders the immediate payment of punitive damages and the amount of to capitalize on the drama. He paused once more. Minus 500 million United States dollars. Like thunder rumbling across the African plains, gasps reverberated around the courtroom. A few of the gallery's followers rose in surprise, their expressions displaying incredulity and indignation. Against this financial nuclear bomb, Ibrahim's legal team's prepared arguments suddenly seemed inconsequential as they glanced at each other. The moment that was meant to signal the loss of Burkina Faso's sovereignty was captured by camera flashes that burst like lightning. Thomas continuously pounded his gavel in an attempt to bring order back to the mayhem he had caused. However, despite all of this chaos, Ibrahim Traoré remained motionless and his face remained unaltered, like smoke from a burning village. The weight of $500 million hung in the air. As he watched the horror spread across the throng, Thomas leaned back in his chair with a look of joy on his face. Furthermore, he continued, his voice raising above the din, failure to pay within 30 days will result in asset seizure and international sanctions. The trap was finished. African independence's neck was tightened by the noose. However, the judge overlooked the fire that was starting to burn in Ibrahim's eyes as he looked about his courtroom kingdom. Slowly, the young president rose to his feet, and his stance caused the audience to quiet down once more. Every eye in the courtroom followed Ibrahim, as he rose from his chair with such deliberateness that it resembled a lion waking from sleep. The quiet was overwhelming. The stenographer in the court even ceased typing, her fingers motionless on the keys. Judge Thomas was expecting helplessness or supplication, but instead he was looking into the cool, collected eyes of a man who had endured far worse treatment than dishonest judges. Uncomfortably, the diplomatic section moved as they realized that their well-arranged show trial might not go as expected. When Ibrahim did speak, it was quietly, yet it had the force of thunder roaring across the savannah. Your Honor, may I address this court? Thomas paused, his sweating palms suddenly feeling insufficient with his script. Although protocol required him to give the defendant a chance to speak, Ibrahim's tone gave him a warning that this would not be the frantic appeal he had expected. Thomas grudgingly answered, "You may proceed," with a note of doubt in his voice. Ibrahim took a step forward for the first time, toward the gallery full of his people, rather than the judge's bench. Each stride echoed like a heartbeat in the quiet courtroom as his boots clicked against the marble floor. He appeared to be followed by the dawn light pouring through the big windows, leaving a long, powerful shadow on the colonial tiles. Ibrahim reiterated, $500 million, his voice now echoing around the room. Slowly he turned, looking at the faces of civilians, journalists, and diplomats. For what crime exactly? For daring to put the people of Burkina Faso before the profits of foreign corporations? Supporters started to sit up taller in their seats as a whisper sounded around the gallery. Ibrahim spoke, his voice getting louder with every word, while Thomas nervously hammered his gavel. For choosing sovereignty over slavery disguised as partnership, it felt as though Ibrahim's presence was causing the room's temperature to change. Despite his best efforts to keep a neutral attitude, Judge Thomas found himself bending forward as he was pulled in by the young president's conviction. Dubois, the French lawyer, scrawled notes quickly, his self-assured grin fading as he felt the atmosphere shift about him. With both hands resting on the defendant's table, Ibrahim turned to face Thomas, his eyes burning with silent wrath. Your Honor, before you destroy a nation with your judgment, perhaps this court should hear about the real criminals in this room. It was so quiet afterward that the sound of a pen falling would have sounded like thunder. Dubois turned pale as Ibrahim dug into his jacket pocket and out a manila folder full of papers. Your Honor, I present to this court evidence of systematic looting that has drained Africa's wealth for decades. With each statement carefully selected and delivered with terrible effect, his voice reverberated around the courtroom like a battle cry. Bailiffs swiftly stopped the anxious murmurs that emerged in the diplomatic section as hands reached for phones, realizing that his meticulously managed courtroom was escaping from his grasp like sand through desperate fingers. Thomas tightened his hold on his gavel. With theatrical precision, Ibrahim opened the folder, drawing everyone's attention with his actions. These documents detail mining contracts signed in secret, environmental destruction covered up, and profits stolen from the people of Burkina Faso. Dubois, his pricey suit now soaked with anxious perspiration, rose to his feet and exclaimed, "These are classified materials." Ibrahim did not acknowledge the interruption, his voice rising with righteous rage that reverberated off the colonial walls. Holding up a photograph of ruined mining sites, he shouted, "Classified to hide the truth from those who own the gold beneath their feet." The gallery erupted, supporters bending forward to capture each disclosure, their ire growing like a brewing storm. Thomas pounded his gavel wildly, yet every second that went by diminished his power. Mr. Dubois stands for companies that have taken more than $2 billion out of our soil while letting our kids drink tainted water. As Ibrahim presented more evidence, including bank statements, classified correspondence, and environmental studies that had been hidden for years, the courtroom erupted in appalled cries and gasps. "Put in order. Place your order." Local journalists scrawled frantically, realizing they were witnessing the expose of a conspiracy that reached from the boardrooms of Paris to the mines of Burkina Faso. Thomas shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure, but the people had heard enough to ignite their fury. Despite the maelstrom raging around him, Ibrahim stood erect amid the tumult, his presence imposing while diplomats gathered around, like conspirators whose plot had been exposed by daylight. These are the real crimes that should be judged in this court. Theft disguised as investment, exploitation wrapped in legal documents. Thomas recognized his $500 million verdict suddenly seemed more like extortion than justice, and his cheeks flushed crimson with humiliation and anger as the evidence spilled across the defendant's table, like evidence of a large crime scene. Each document another nail in the coffin of colonial exploitation, with supporters singing Ibrahim's name and others demanding answers from the wriggling diplomatic section. The gallery was now standing, and as Dubois tried to grab his documents and flee, Ibrahim's voice sliced through the cacophony like a sword. Through silk, Your Honor, I submit that this court lacks the moral authority to judge a people fighting for their freedom. The hunter became the prey as the words lingered in the air like an unavoidable challenge. Ibrahim produced another document, this one with an official seal that caused Judge Thomas's face to become completely white. With a voice like a razor slicing through the confusion, Ibrahim declared, Your Honor, perhaps the court should know about your own financial interests in the Curry gold mine. Dubois urgently beckoned for Thomas to stop the proceedings. But it was too late. The truth was leaking out like water from a broken dam, and the courtroom fell silent once again, as all eyes turned to Thomas, who suddenly appeared to be a man witnessing his world fall in real time. Thomas grabbed the edge of his bench, his knuckles white with the strain of attempting to keep his cool while his past transgressions came to light, and the diplomatic section exchanged terrified looks. Understanding their carefully picked judge was suddenly a liability rather than an asset. Ibrahim went on. Bank records show regular payments of $50,000 monthly to Thomas Holdings LLC. His voice as steady and unyielding as the rain in the morning. As supporters realized the full extent of the corruption they were watching, the gallery erupted in irate shouts, and local journalists scrawled frantically, knowing they were covering one of the largest scandals in the nation's judicial history. A young Burkinabe woman who worked as Thomas's law clerk looked at her boss with a look of surprise and hatred on her face. A motion to dismiss on the grounds of a conflict of interest in the judiciary. Fatou, Ibrahim's attorney, yelled over the din. The evidence continued to pour in as Ibrahim disclosed that Thomas had purchased a lavish property in Virginia, paid for by mining payments over the previous 3 years, making the judge, who had appeared so powerful moments earlier, now appear to be a small man caught in a very massive deception. Thomas hammered his gavel frantically, his power eroding like ancient walls under the attack of truth and transparency. While pictures of the judge's residence flashed across phones in the gallery as citizens shared the startling disclosures, in real time, this process is not in order, he yelled, but the people's righteous rage overpowered his words. As the morning sun streamed through the windows, it appeared to highlight every drop of perspiration on Thomas's guilty face, and Dubois was already packing his briefcase, ready to ditch his compromised comrade like a sinking ship. A number of court officials exchanged doubtful looks, not knowing if they should obey a judge whose moral character was crumbling in front of them. Thomas's previous arrogance was replaced by desperation as he sprang up suddenly, his black robes billowing, and pointed an accusing finger at Ibrahim. You are unable to validate those claims, he cried out. A sea of irate faces now filled the gallery, residents who had trusted the legal system and discovered it to be completely corrupted. Yet the documents scattered on the defendant's table revealed a different tale. As Thomas's legal authority disintegrated, Ibrahim maintained his composure in the middle of the turmoil, his moral authority strengthening. Ibrahim said, Your Honor, the only criminal in this courtroom is sitting behind that bench. His words, resounding like a verdict. One old woman in traditional clothing was the first to stand, her aged fists held high as she yelled in more, liar, a thief. The entire gallery was on its feet in a matter of seconds. A wave of righteous rage sweeping over the colonial courthouse, like a river rupturing ancient boundaries as her voice cracked with decades of repressed anger against corrupt officials who had stolen her children's future. Teachers, farmers, market vendors, and young students were all indignant over the corruption they had just seen. The outcry of those who had finally realized the truth drowned out Thomas's desperate gavel banging. Unsure of whether to join the rebellion or restore order, the bailiffs gazed at one another in helplessness. The chorus, which started in the back rows and quickly went across the audience, was down with corrupt judges, down with colonial thieves. As Burkina Faso's people regained their dignity in real time, phones were lifted high, and the world watched live. A number of court officers took off their caps, refusing to enforce the authority of a judge they now knew was bought and paid for, and the diplomatic section huddled around like scared animals, their carefully worked plans crumbling in the face of popular opposition. The colonial architecture of the courtroom seemed to tremble under the weight of voices that had been silenced for too long, and Ibrahim observed the sight with quiet satisfaction, knowing that truth possessed a power no amount of money could mute. with a gnarled finger that had worked the gold mines for 40 years. An elderly man with tribal scars pushed forward and pointed squarely at Thomas. "You stole the gold from under our feet, and now you want to steal our president, too." His words pierced the cacophony like a prophecy. The French lawyer Dubois attempted to escape toward the exit, but was stopped by residents who recognized him from the documents Ibrahim had showed, and market women started to ululate, their customary cries of celebration blending with the irate screams to create a symphony of defiance. The people had found their voice, and it was deafening in its strength and unity. Thomas's law clerk got up and left, her resignation evident in every step as she left her compromised position. Children who had skipped school to witness history were now witnessing their parents and grandparents challenge authority in ways they never thought possible. And the courtroom had changed from a temple of imposed justice to a platform of popular uprising. With the colonial order collapsing under the weight of exposed corruption, Thomas gripped his gavel like a weapon, but he understood it was helpless against the moral authority of an aroused populace. Ibrahim stayed sat, allowing the people's rage to flood the courtroom like purifying rain after a protracted drought. The sounds of assembling throngs outside indicated that word was getting out beyond the courtroom walls, and the morning that had started with his trap to destroy African freedom was now turning into a celebration of African dignity. The revolution was no longer controlled. The people's righteous rage overtook Judge Thomas's words as he stood behind his bench like a cornered animal, his black robes providing no shelter from the storm of accountability swirling around him. "I order this court to come to order," he screamed, his voice cracking under the pressure. Thomas's gavel was lying abandoned on his desk, as worthless as a broken sword in the hands of a defeated general. The bailiffs had given up trying to manage the mob, with several openly nodding in agreement with the chants resonating off the colonial walls. His eyes flew wildly about the courtroom, looking for an escape route that didn't exist, and he felt sweat stream down his face as he realized the authority he had held for years was vanishing like morning mist under the African sun. Of security, a burly Burkinabe man named Usman crossed his arms and looked at the judge with open contempt. "We serve justice, not thieves," Usman said, his words bearing the weight of every honest officer who had witnessed corruption flourish. In their courts, Thomas had ordered security. "Clear this courtroom immediately." However, even his own court officers had abandoned him. Thomas's legal books, emblems of his educated authority, seemed to mock him from their shelves as the People's Court overtook his purchased justice, and the diplomatic section was in full retreat, pressing for the exits as irate citizens barred their path with accusations and questions. The morning light coming through the lofty windows now revealed a total reversal of power, with Thomas alone on his high bench like a prisoner in his own dock, and even the court reporter had ceased transcribing, her allegiance now being to the virtuous gallery rather than the corrupt bench. "This is contempt of court," he cried in desperation, but the crowd laughed back bitter, knowing laughter that signaled the revelation of years of injustice. Ibrahim sat quietly as he watched the colonial order fall apart around him like walls made of sand at last meeting the tide. And as the chants became more unified and louder, the ululations of market ladies blended with the revolutionary melodies of the students. His throne of judgment had turned into a platform of disgrace, raised only to make his fall more obvious to everyone. Thomas hastily clutched his papers in an attempt to regain some semblance of control, but they were scattered like leaves in the wind of change. With Thomas now acting as the accused rather than the judge, the courtroom had transformed into a theater of popular justice, and citizens rushed forward, their faces burning with the fervor of those who had finally peeled back the curtain of false authority. Thomas looked frantically toward the door where Dubois had fled, realizing that he had been abandoned by his fellow conspirators like a sacrifice to the people's wrath. "Confess your crimes," someone yelled from the back, and dozens of voices joined in, turning the demand into a thunderous chorus. Once intimidating the populace, the colonial architecture now appeared to loom accusingly over him, with each stone bearing witness to his corruption. Ibrahim eventually got to his feet, and the audience fell hushed as they awaited the words of the man who had revealed the corruption at the core of their legal system. He approached the judge's bench carefully, taking deliberate, measured steps, much like a general assessing a battlefield that has been overrun. Thomas cowered behind his desk, the elevation that had formerly made him seem powerful, now making him look like a trapped animal on exhibit, and the throng parted before him in reverent quiet, realizing they were watching an event that would be remembered for generations. Nobody in the room missed the irony in Ibrahim's voice as he said, "Your Honor," the words hung in the air like a regal decree, bearing the weight of popular mandate rather than official authority. "I believe it's time for you to step down from that bench." Even the sunlight appeared to change, brightening Ibrahim's way forward, while putting Thomas in obscurity. As Ibrahim's challenge reverberated through the courtroom like thunder crashing across the savannah, the spectators burst into applause. The audience screamed, "Come down, face the people," their voices united in a demand that went beyond the formalities of the court system and spoke to something fundamental about accountability and justice. Thomas, his costly education and judicial training ineffective against the moral authority of an aroused populace, clutched the edge of his bench with white knuckles. In order to demonstrate that they would not shield a dishonest judge from the repercussions of his actions, the security guards moved aside. When Ibrahim arrived at the bottom of the judge's platform, his eyes, which were burning with African dignity, glared up at Thomas. He remarked, "You wanted to fine me $500 million, his voice echoing around the room. But you cannot put a price on a people's freedom." People started yelling their own verdicts against the corrupted judge, turning the courtroom into a platform for popular democracy. One accusation after another struck Thomas's eroding composure like arrows. Guilty of theft, guilty of corruption, guilty of betraying justice. Once emblems of power, his black robes now resembled the outfit of a failed performer whose act had been revealed. Thomas really flinched, his chair scraping the floor in a last-ditch effort to keep his distance as Ibrahim ascended the first step toward the bench. Brick by brick, lie after lie, the colonial system that had placed dishonest judges above the populace was falling apart in real time. In a total reversal that would reverberate throughout Africa, the morning that had started with Thomas's trap had turned into Ibrahim's victory. Thomas stood up and aimed his gavel at Ibrahim like a weapon in a last-ditch effort to regain control. He yelled, "I am still the judge in this court," but the gallery laughed mockingly at his assertion. Ibrahim calmly grinned and stepped up. Again, getting near enough to see the terror behind Thomas's gold-rimmed glasses, Ibrahim said, "You were never our judge," in a quiet but authoritative manner. "You were just their puppet." As the truth descended upon the courtroom like dawn light, erasing the final vestiges of imperial deceit, the audience yelled its appreciation. With his gavel falling to the ground, Thomas signaled the end of his corrupt rule and the start of a new one. Ibrahim now represented his people's victory over corruption before the judge's bench, rather than as a defendant. A courtroom that had been converted from a shrine of colonial justice into a representation of African sovereignty was bathed in golden light as the morning sun shone through the tall windows. Like a nighttime robber, Thomas had escaped by a back door, leaving behind his robes and his false authority. Their voices rose in traditional songs of victory that their predecessors had sang after great battles, and the audience burst into excitement. The day a young president revealed the lies that had ensnared their country was a story that youngsters who had witnessed this momentous occasion would tell their grandkids. Like the corrupt system that created it, the $500 million fine was useless and lay forgotten on the floor, like wildfire spreading across dry grass. The news of victory swept throughout Ouagadougou, as citizens rushed out of the courthouse and onto the streets, with their voices resonating off the colonial buildings that had formerly terrified them, but now appeared to have less authority. Market ladies ululated with delight. Red, green, and yellow flags gleamed against the beautiful morning sky as students hoisted them high above their heads. The diplomatic vehicles that had arrived with such assurance suddenly slunk away like vanquished predators, their occupants calling in a panic to report that their well-thought-out plans had failed. Thousands of supporters were assembled when Ibrahim came from the courthouse, their faces glowing with the joy of a people who had regained their honor. Like a brand new national song, the sound of their celebration reverberated across the city. The foreign reporters who had come to cover Ibrahim's downfall ended up covering the fall of a corrupt judicial cabal instead. Camera crews caught footage of regular people dancing in the streets, their happiness contagious and their message obvious to onlookers. The mining contracts that had appeared so invincible that morning were now revealed to be fictitious agreements intended to embezzle a country's riches. From the steps of the courthouse, Ibrahim spoke to the crowd. "Today, we prove that no amount of money can purchase the soul of a free people." His statement was straightforward, yet impactful. Like rain after a protracted drought, his voice reverberated around the assembly like a prayer answered. After starting in a courtroom, the revolution quickly expanded to the streets and would soon reach every community in Burkina Faso. A fresh chapter in the tale of a people who had resisted being intimidated and corrupted was revealed as the sun rose higher in the African sky. Behind Ibrahim, the courtroom stood as a testament to the triumph of truth over lies, rather than as a symbol of colonial dominance. Fairness triumphs over greed. With homemade flags in hand, children dashed through the masses, their laughter blending with the voices of their elders to create a symphony of freedom, not in monetary terms, but in terms of honor, independence, and the indomitable spirit of Africa. The $500 million trap had turned into a $5 billion triumph. Ibrahim's remarks would reverberate throughout history, while Thomas's gavel would rust in some forgotten drawer. The brightest light Burkina Faso had seen in generations arrived with the dawn that had threatened to bring darkness. Ibrahim Traoré proved that truth always triumphs over money and deception by turning a $500 million trap into Africa's biggest victory against judicial corruption.